Welcome to the Mad in America podcast, your source for science, psychiatry, and social justice. Welcome back to the Mad in America Rethinking Mental Health podcast. I'm your host, Justin Carter. And today we're picking up where we left off with Dr. Brent Dean Robbins, psychologist, scholar, and someone who has spent his life thinking deeply about what it actually means to be human. In part one, we talked about the big picture stuff. Brent's early influences, his critiques of mainstream psychiatry, and his work in diagnostic reform. If you haven't listened to that yet, I'd recommend going back and checking that out first. Now, in part two, we get personal. We talk about Brent's book, The Medicalized Body and Anesthetic Culture, which unpacks how modern medicine tries to shield us from the rawness of suffering and death, and in doing so, maybe dulls what it means to really live. We explore his love for humanistic psychology and its untapped potential. And we talk about his own health journey, what it means to confront mortality, not just as a psychologist, but as a person, living in real time with all the uncertainty and rawness that entails. For me, this is one of the most important conversations I've had the pleasure of having on this podcast. Here we go. This links up to your book, The Medicalized Body and Anesthetic Culture, which goes beyond the sort of usual critique of medicalization, maybe critical psychiatry work that we're taking social problems and moving them into the medical sphere, and actually says that this becomes the medical gaze can be a useful lens in solving certain sorts of problems, but when it becomes a dominant cultural gaze through which we interpret ourselves and the world, it becomes really problematic and pathogenic, as you say. Could you say more about how your work on medicalization connects up to sort of the cultural problems that you see being at the root of some of the mental health crises we deem in our world today?
Where I was trying to trace the origins of a kind of medical model of thinking, but not only the medical model, but how the medical model influenced the culture, Western culture in general. And so I traced that back to, the Renaissance and the emergence of, modern anatomy. And I've just studied that history very carefully. And ultimately what I discovered and wrote about in the book is that, medical doctors, especially as religion becomes, in the Enlightenment, religion becomes less and less influential on the culture as the culture becomes more secularized. People turn more and more to medicine to answer fundamental existential questions. Instead of going to the priest, they go to their doctor, And by the way, doctors are really uncomfortable about that. They don't really like being in that role, but people put them in that role, whether they like it or not. I think that's that's very profound, because if you study anthropology, any culture, the priest is always also the medical doctor. They're always the person who's in charge of medicine is almost always the person who is at the interface between life and death, or the spiritual leader as well, the shaman being, So I think it's really that it's interesting, something that happens as in the Enlightenment age, where you lose the sort of spiritual foundations of the culture in the spirit of becoming more, let's say, inclusive, creating a separation between church and state, and so on and so forth. One of the downsides of that is medicine takes on this status that it's not able to sort of manage, because it's missing a religious or spiritual dimension, because it's become purely biological in its orientation. It doesn't really have answers to existential questions. So I was interested in, what's the journey? How did that happen? So what I was able to discover was there was a profound transformation that happens between really the 12th and the 15th century, as you can kind of trace the development of modern anatomy. And one thing I thought was really interesting is the fact that, there's a myth that it was considered taboo, or it was outlawed to dissect, cadavers in the Middle Ages. But actually that wasn't true. That people did autopsies on loved ones to find out, what kind of disease they had and whether it was inheritable. They even had a concept of inheritance back then. So if, let's say, the mother in a family dies, There are cases where, the father would commission a doctor to do an autopsy on the mother to see if they had some kind of inheritable disease that could affect the children. And that kind of stuff was done and documented by Catherine Park, who's a fantastic historian in this area. And I drew a lot from Catherine Park's work. And but then the other thing that was interesting is there were autopsies that were done on women who were prospective saints. So you would have someone who's believed to be like a mystic, a female mystic, and the women that when the woman would die, instead of getting a doctor, the other nuns in the nunnery would dissect the sister upon her death, looking for signs of saintliness in the body. The idea would be that somehow the holiness of the person would draw in sort of spiritual forces that would transform the body in certain ways. Like the stigmata would be an example of that, where people get the wounds of Christ in their hands. In this case, there's cases of saints where they're looking for they find a cross in the heart of the person, something that's shaped in the size in the something that has the shape of a cross in the heart, for example. Or somebody finds 3 stones, I think, in the gallbladder, and they think that is somehow a sign of the Trinity or something like that. So they're looking for signs of saintliness in the bodies of their as a way of making a case that this person should be canonized as a saint. So that was another way that bodies were understood. You might say that there's a way of understanding the body as as potentially diseased, but in that case it was a loved one commissioning the dissection of another loved one in the service of care of the children, of maybe being aware of potential heritable disease that could affect the children. And in the case of the nuns who were dissecting their fellow sisters, they were looking for signs of holiness. So you have a kind of sacred body, the belief that this is a sacred body and there'd be signs of the sacred within the body. You don't see dissection happening in medical schools until 14th century. And then when that happens, something peculiar happens that I think is really important, which is when the doctors begin to do dissection, they make certain rules because they know that doing a public dissection of a body could be potentially embarrassing to the person. So they make a rule that the person has to be a certain distance. They have to be at least 10 miles away from the medical school. So that they're more likely to be anonymous. And they were criminals. They had to be criminal bodies. And something that I found very meaningful, and it gave me an insight into what was going on here, is that the criminals, when they were died, they didn't volunteer. They didn't volunteer to become, a medical specimen. It was an extension of their capital punishment. So the judges would punish them to public execution, but then part of their punishment would be extended that they would be publicly dissected as a form of humiliation. So you have, instead of a sacred body that's revered, for its relics, say with the saints, or in the case of a loved one being dissected, you have here a kind of stigmatized body. And I think this lends itself in early medical anatomy to an attitude of detachment from the person who's being dissected. You have a kind of, when somebody's stigmatized, you have a kind of emotional detachment from them. You're not identifying with them, like you would if you were dissecting a loved one. So, and I see this as the beginning of what later gets called, a kind of detached concern, which becomes a normative aspiration. It's, in other words, you put gross anatomy, where you dissect cadavers, at the very beginning of medical school, so you can socialize the doctor into having this detached concern where they can, cut into a body and not get emotional about it, So I call that attitude anesthetic consciousness. Like you can cut into a body of a dead person and not feel bad about that person being dead. And And that becomes a way of sort of coping with the fact that as a medical doctor, you have to deal with death and dying all the time.
And you see this sort of becoming pervasive in the culture as well, this sort of linking anesthetic culture with anhedonia and other sort of forms of disconnection from our own bodies.
Right. So I think because doctors become sort of secular priests, they have a profound, and people look up to doctors for questions about what's normative. This kind of detachment, clinical detachment, becomes an ideal to which men in particular, but remember, we're talking about, this is well before the women's movement. So this idea of detached concerns, this clinical detachment, becomes a normative ideal outside of the medical establishment within the culture at large. And I think it has an influence also on modern science. It predates, Galileo. Well, it's contemporary with Galileo, but it predates Newton and Descartes. So this idea in science is that in order to know something, you have to subtract the subjective and leave nothing but the objective. That whole idea, that whole epistemology, I would argue, has its roots in this sort of medical culture. And all the scientists of the Renaissance were, medical doctors as well. Somebody in the Renaissance, people were scientists and artists and doctors all at the same time. So they were getting medical training as well as scientific training. And those trainings influenced each other.
And the sort of detached concern becomes a cultural standard for how we view our relationship with the larger world. And then particularly our bodies, you focus on sort of the lived body and embodiment quite a bit in the book. I guess, could you say more about anhedonia and our connection with the bodies post Descartes?
Yeah, I mean, that came out of the insight there came out of research that I did because I was interested in this stuff historically. I got interested in interviewing medical students in gross anatomy. And when I was at Damon College in Buffalo, they have a physician's assistant program, and the students in the PA program have to take gross anatomy in their senior year where they dissect a cadaver. So I worked with the physician's assistant faculty and with an undergraduate student to do an ethnographic and phenomenological study of these students. So we would observe them in the process of cadaver dissection and took notes, but we also had them write diaries, do a journal and about their experience. And they would submit those to us by email on a regular basis. And then we did a phenomenological analysis of the ethnographic and diary entries. So one of the things that came out of that study was that most students perceived the body as ambiguous in its status. On the one hand, it was a person who had died, like this is somebody's grandmother, and their children and their grandchildren are still probably mourning them now, because it's probably not long after they died that they're doing the dissection. And there would be moments where they would see nail polish or, something that remind them that this is a person, when they were doing the dissection. On the other hand, they were engaged with this body as a specimen, kind of like a fascinating, machine. And the vast majority of the people couldn't hold those two things together in their head, in their experience. Either they were looking at it as a person or they had to suppress the personhood of the cadaver in order to go on with the dissection. That was the majority of the people. There was a small minority, in fact, 2 of the participants who were an exception to that, who were somehow able to hold those two things together. They were able to do the dissection and have a I would say a kind of relationship with the cadaver. Like they would describe naming the cadaver. They didn't know what their name was, but they gave them a name. They started to, through their imagination, but based on evidence of what they were finding in the dissection, reconstruct what that person's life was like and what their personality was like, and they would have conversations with them in their imagination. And they would do this while they were engaged in dissection. That was, I found, really remarkable. But most people had to keep those, they had to suppress the idea that this is a person in order to be able to dissect. So I needed terms to describe this, what's being suppressed here. So I called it the memorial body, because I think the body that's a memorial is the body that makes you think about the person, right, who they were prior to their death. And so a memorial body is the kind of body you encounter at a funeral. And ethnographically, if you observe what it's like to be at a funeral versus what it's like to be in a cadaver lab, it's striking, that at a funeral, all the personal parts of the body are on display. The face, the hands, are on display. And those are the most personal parts of someone's body. But when you go into a cadaver lab, they start the dissection with the person on their stomach. So you dissect the back first. And the head and the hands and the feet and other personal aspects of the body are covered over. So you have no idea what the person looks like until you're halfway through the semester, when they flip the body over and you see the face for the first time. And this is a very profound experience for the students. They had dreams, they had nightmares about it. A lot of anxiety leading up to seeing the face of their cadaver for the first time, because now, how can you deny that this is a person when you see their face? So then I realized, so much of the culture in medicine, in particular the way medical doctors are being educated, that it actually promoted this sort of anesthetic consciousness, this kind of clinical detachment, was actually promoting a suppression of the personhood of the cadaver. But that was a sort of a pre-training, right? A train that would prepare them to be able to distance themselves from the personhood of their patients and to be able to see their patients purely as specimen. And I started to think, being charitable here, that there's probably contexts as a doctor where that's important to be able to do that, to be able to compartmentalize. I was thinking about, let's say you're doing brain surgery on a 3-year-old child. It's probably going to be helpful if you're not thinking, I'm doing brain surgery on a 3-year-old child right now, and to be able to purely focus on the sort of mechanics. That may be a very useful way of coping with that peculiar situation of a surgeon, and you might need to have that kind of emotional detachment to be able to do that kind of surgery. So I don't deny that this might be a useful form of coping. The problem is that it's not particularly helpful, say, in general medicine, where you have to have good bedside manner and you have to relate to your patients. And it's not particularly helpful in psychiatry, where the relationship is so important. And then when it gets beyond medicine into the culture at large, I think it leads to all kinds of problems. And I could get into lots of details here, but I trace this kind of suppression of the personhood of people as a kind of aspiration to objectivity, to scientific racism and all kinds of problematic cultural practices. As a way of coping with the fact that this is during the period of time when slavery is, chattel slavery is the norm, right, within the United States in the 1800s. I trace in the book, like how do you cope with the fact that you're taking human beings and you're essentially reducing them to objects for your use? I mean, you have to have a kind of detachment in order to be able to do that.
The kind of a detachment that arises in like a potentially traumatizing situation for an individual, whether you're doing brain surgery on a 3-year-old child or you're in a war situation, and that kind of detachment prevents you from confronting the personhood of the person you're fighting. When that sort of psychological response becomes the cultural norm for dealing with other people, it can be used to justify all sorts of horrifics.
Right. It becomes a way of objectifying people in a way that allows you to dehumanize them and basically use them as a means to your own end without being concerned for their welfare. So whether we're talking about slavery or we're talking about, genocide of the Native American people, which is something I talk about in the book as well, or you talk about objectification of women, is something I talk about in the book as well. I think that's all part of this culture. It's all a product of this particular culture of anesthetic consciousness.
The need to like numb ourselves from the horror of the loss of another person, then becoming the sort of tool by which we oppress and destroy.
Right. Now, there's something hopeful in what I'm saying here, because what I'm suggesting is that this is an unnatural thing. It's like we have to be socialized to be that detached. It's not, I don't think it's normative for men to objectify women in that way. We get taught to be that way. The culture teaches us to view women that way. It teaches us to view people in a way that allows us to objectify them. So that means that it can be undone. If we remove those processes of socialization where we're taught to know things means to detach yourself from them. And instead, knowing is what I would argue is more of need to move towards a kind of knowledge. This maybe sounds a little schmaltzy, but I call it a hermeneutics of love. Actually, you really get to know something if you love it. Abraham Maslow makes this point in his work. He talks about love knowledge, and he talks about when he worked with the rhesus monkeys with Harry Harlow. He loved those monkeys. Like he really cared about those monkeys. And he said he wouldn't have learned as much as he would have learned if he hadn't loved them, if he had just seen them as specimens. And it kind of disturbed them. It disturbed him what happened to them as a result of Harry Harlow's experiments. And that had an influence on his turn toward the humanistic turn that he would take.
I remember you driving this point home for us as students, and this is now 10 years ago for me, but when you had us do Goethean science, and we didn't just study the botany of a plant that you had in the classroom, but you had us draw it and sort of summon a lens of viewing the flower that was one of loving affection or interest, curiosity, and then to draw it repeatedly and notice its changes over time. And then to realize how much we learned about the plant through that lens, rather than that we would not have had access to had we just been sort of studying the plant as plant from an objective point of view.
Exactly. So I've written a couple of papers on Goethean science as a cultural therapeutic. It's precisely a kind of epistemology that is an antidote to this idea of objectivity as a kind of detachment, as a kind of anesthetic consciousness, that instead if you study something, the way to come to know it is through a kind of intimacy. Is the only way to describe it. The way you get to know a friend. Craig Holdridge, who's a contemporary Goethean scientist, you read that paper back when you were in grad school where he talked about the skunk cabbage. Like when I read that paper, I had no idea what a skunk cabbage was. If somebody says, "What's a skunk cabbage?" I would have had no idea what they were talking about. But after reading that paper, and I'm not a botanist, so I don't know that much about plants. I'm not one of those people that can go in the woods and sort of point out what things are, But having read Holdridge, every time I go into the woods and I see a skunk cabbage, I get excited. Like, oh, there's a skunk cabbage. Like I care about it. Because he, in his description of the skunk cabbage, he brings it alive as this living being that has its own meaning and purpose. And you kind of, it has the exact opposite of what a lot of reductive approach to science does, which makes you think, oh, well, that's just a mechanism like everything else. You see its distinctive qualities, and you recognize its intrinsic dignity, really, even as a plant.
Well, maybe that's a perfect point to bring it all home to the critique of psychiatry and psychology, because um, yeah, there's this sort of the diagnostic framing that you pushed back against in the DSM-5 lends itself to viewing our clients or other people or even ourselves through this sort of diagnostic gaze, this medicalized distancing, objective gaze. And when the humanistic existential psychology you're pushing for is one that actually calls us into relationship with the world and with other people and our clients and ourselves in a way that allows for a different sort of experience to emerge of that thing, of that person, of that of ourselves.
So I think, you know, to study psychiatry and psychology and psychopathology from a human science perspective, from a phenomenological perspective, is very much in that tradition of Goethean science. Where you can't, you're not going to really get to. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not somebody who is opposed to quantitative research or experimentation. I think it's very valuable within its proper context. The problem is reductionism, where you reduce everything to, you take a complex person and you reduce them to a particular formula based on, nomothetic data, and you miss all the richness and complexity and uniqueness of the person in front of you. So there's the phenomenological brings in the ideographic, what's unique and distinctive about each person, and you're able to account for that, as well as generalities. You can keep both of those in mind at the same time. The other thing that I think phenomenology does when it comes to psychiatry, and something I think we need to, that I'm going to be talking about at APA, but I think we need to think about, is most of our diagnostic approaches and the way we formulate cases today in psychology and clinical psychology, and even in social work, sadly, because social work really should be an exception, is that we tend to think about symptom reduction. We want to identify what's the diagnosis, what are the symptoms, and then we reduce symptoms. So if you think about that, anxiety is a symptom, right? It's something we identify as a symptom to be eradicated, to be reduced. And yet, what's more human than anxiety? Like, if you completely eliminated anxiety, that wouldn't be a psychiatric success. You would create somebody who's inhuman. I write about this in the book. If you give somebody anti-anxiety medication, that diminishes their capacity for empathy, for example. So not only are you getting rid of anxiety, but you're losing other capacities, because emotions serve multiple functions. And so anyway, I think that we need to move away from this idea that we need to reduce symptoms and instead think in terms of, and here I'm influenced, I'll give credit where credit is due. I'm influenced by Medard Boss, one of the earliest existential psychiatrists who was influenced by Heidegger. He talked about the goal of psychiatry is not to reduce symptoms, is to expand the patient's possibilities for being in the world, to expand their potentiality, not reduce. If you're reducing things, you're reducing their potentialities. You're taking something that you're defining as a symptom and you're reducing it. You're eliminating it from their existence. Instead, you expand a person's possibilities for being, not eliminating possibilities. So I think that's a big shift, and a paradigm shift that I would like to see happen. And the other thing that I think is really important, which we've touched on already, is that we need a diagnostic system that where we can diagnose, literally label pathogenic, psychopathogenic social systems. And like, even if you see a couple in couples therapy, you have to, for billing purposes, you have to diagnose one of the individuals. You can't diagnose the couple. And yet everyone knows, if you're trained in couples therapy, when you're doing couples therapy, you're not treating the individuals, you're treating the couple. The couple is your patient. So why don't we have diagnostic labels for couples, for the couple as a system, as a dialogical system? Why don't we have labels for family systems that are dysfunctional? We don't. There's nothing in the DSM or any other medical diagnostic manual for identifying when a family needs intervention. And then I think everybody understands that intuitively. When couples have problems, it doesn't mean that one or both of the couples have a mental illness. It's often systemic, and it has roots in their history, in their family histories, patterns that are repeated over generations. Same thing with families in general. So I think most people get that. That's not hard for most people to understand. But why can't we go beyond that and say, well, aren't there psychopathogenic neighborhoods or cities or organizations, corporations, let's say, that are harming their employees, or psychopathogenic nations, even, So I think we don't have any kind of tools for thinking about that. And if we don't have any tools for thinking about it, people are not going to think about it. They're going to ignore it. And the psychiatric system is going to collude with that scapegoating problem that we talked about earlier. So those are things that I think I would like to really see some movement on in the coming years.
And as somebody who has so specifically laid out that one of these sort of pathogenic features of our modern culture is this aversion to death and this difficulty with being able to like stay with our death anxiety and look it in the face and then be able to think through it rather than avoid it or defend against it. To then, in recent months, to have your own death anxiety aroused by a cancer diagnosis. I'm wondering if you could share a little bit with our listeners about what you've been going through and sort of how you've been reconciling that with your unique background and the work you've done as an existential psychologist and theorist.
Yeah. So I had, something very profound happened. I'll never forget the date, October 21st. I went into the hospital with pain under my rib cage and some things that were going on in my bowel movements and my urine that looked abnormal, and also jaundice, my yellowing of the skin. And I knew that when I started to see those collection of symptoms, maybe liver or something like that was going on. So I went to my doctor, and ultimately, to make a long story short, I ended up in the ER and got a CT scan. And that day, the very first day I was in the ER, they got my CT scan back within 2 hours. And the doctor told me, very frankly, you have a very large mass on your pancreas. And knowing the size of it and the way it's growing, he says, this is invariably, he says it's pancreatic cancer. He said, we have to do a biopsy. It could be, in theory, it could, maybe not be, but he says, based on, what I've seen before, you should prepare yourself, So, right out of the gate, my wife was there. We got that news. And then what I eventually found out over the course of that week is not only did I have pancreatic cancer, but it was stage 4 pancreatic cancer that it had metastasized to my liver. That's what the biopsy ended up showing. So if you have basically, if you're going to get a cancer diagnosis, like that's like one of the worst possible ones you can get in terms of prognosis. The oncologist said to me, very frankly, the first time I met her, like basically there's no cure for this cancer. It's they give you chemotherapy, but it's palliative, meaning the chemotherapy is there to maybe expand your lifespan and maybe improve the quality of your life in terms of reducing some of the symptoms by shrinking, the tumors for a period of time and things like that. But it ultimately, the cancer ends up winning against the chemotherapy. So I was laying around in the hospital for a week. I had to get a biopsy. I had to get I forget what they call it. I had to get a thing in my to clear the bile that was blocked. So it was so I had a lot of time to think, in the hospital. lay around and think. But, what I ultimately came out of with that is, I mean, you can't underestimate what news like that does in terms of radically transforming the way you live your life, the way you're operating in the world. And that's certainly true in my case. On the other hand, and this is, I think, really interesting, there's two observations I would kind of make. All of my preparation, all of my work in existential theory and thinking about death and dying, and not just in an intellectual way. This has been something that I've always tried to really incorporate into my life. It's, when I talk about my philosophies, it's never just an intellectual exercise. I'm writing about things that I find personally meaningful and relevant to my life. And so in many ways, I've been spending my career preparing for this moment, and that's paid off in the sense that, I've never been, even at the hospital, I was I kind of took this news with a certain equanimity that almost surprised me. It surprised me, honestly, that I was able to hear what the doctor was saying. I was able to have a very coherent conversation. I asked a lot of difficult questions right out of the gate in a way that, it didn't fit the usual models, like the Kubler-Ross model where you start with denial. I didn't go through denial. I thought, oh, well, okay, I'm going to die. You can't live, you can't survive this thing. It's just a matter of time, So then the next question was, then I just started asking very pragmatic questions like, well, are my kids and my wife going to be taken care of, right? Or financially, are they going to be okay? And then, well, am I going to be able to teach my classes for a period of time while I'm on chemotherapy? Like I was asking very practical questions, very soon out of the gate. And once I got those questions, and most of those, it took a few weeks to work that out. I had to, work with the chair of my department and the HR department to figure out how we were going to do things, work around my chemotherapy so I can still teach and do my scholarship. Once I kind of worked out those details and found, and we're very fortunate we have some really good insurance policies that will help my wife and kids with when I'm gone. So those are some of the big worries that I had, like very practical concerns. And then it really, interestingly enough, what was left over in facing a very protracted lifespan was two things: is an absolutely overwhelming outpouring of love and support from so many people. That has been the most meaningful and profound thing that's ever happened to me in my life. Like just people coming out, people I haven't talked to for a long time. An ex-girlfriend's sister wrote me a letter, who just happens to be friends with me on Facebook, and that's how they knew. And she wrote me this long letter about what an impact I had on her back when I was like 20 years old, when I was dating her sister. I mean, it's so many. I've gotten letters, I've gotten people writing me and meeting in person with friends I haven't seen for a while. And all I'm getting is just absolute love. And wow, what a blessing, for that. So I'm very, I realized, if I'd have just had a heart attack and died, I would have missed out on all this, So I'm just very, it's hard to describe, the fact on the one hand, I'm finding out I'm going to die, but on the other hand, I'm getting this beautiful opportunity to hear from the many people how much they love me and how much they appreciate me. And that's been one of the most meaningful things that I've ever experienced. And in addition to that, I'll get very personal here. My relationship with my wife has gotten much more closer. I remember as soon as this happened, when we were in the hospital, I looked at my wife and I said, I don't want this. I want this to make us closer. I don't want this to tear us apart, you know? And that's what and it actually, I think we're closer and more intimate and more affectionate than we've ever been in our many years of marriage. Uh, and the other thing that happens when you're, at least in my case, because of the particular mindset that I have, I've conditioned myself to face my mortality, is that in the face of my mortality and the recognition of the limited time I have, it's hard to describe in a way that doesn't sound trivial how profound and significant little things become. You know, a sunset, you know, the leaves changing in the fall, and just seeing the beauty of that here in Pennsylvania where I live. Right today, the snowfall, and just looking outside and seeing the beauty of the snow outside. Like the just the beauty of things has a much more profound effect on me now than it did prior to this. Because I realize, you know, this might be my last winter I experience, given the typical, the prognosis is very poor for this diagnosis. So if I live beyond a year, I'm beating the odds, right? So looking out and seeing the snow, I think, well, this could be my last time I see this. And so it becomes very significant and beautiful, and that maximizes the beauty of it. So I'm having a lot of some of the most positive experiences of my life in the wake of the most horrible news you can get. And that's, to me, the paradox of what I've been teaching my whole career, is that facing death is the thing we are most terrified of. But when we come to terms with it, when we really face it, it gives birth to the most profound joy, and also a deeper intimacy with those around us. And those are the two things I'm experiencing: profound joy and deep love and connection to people in the face of this very terrible diagnosis. And that really validates everything that I've learned over the years academically. I'm now living it, and I'm like, yeah, that was true. Now I know it was true because I'm experiencing it firsthand.
I want to say thank you for being willing to kind of share with me and our listeners like most personal aspects of what dealing with this news has been like for you, and what it's been like to live in that state. And it seems like a clear also validation of the work you've been talking about and the theory you've been talking about in our conversation, that, yeah, if we can create a culture, or even, you know, a field of psychology, to be less ambitious, but if we could create a culture that can make peace with and look directly at our existential condition, it opens up a way of knowing about ourselves and the world that actually creates conditions for love, or creates the conditions for joy, and gratitude, and a sense of sort of our finiteness on this spinning rock being important, and also small, something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, there's such a danger of it sounding trivial, because it's been trivialized culturally about how central love is to having a meaningful life, you know. And we've sentimentalized love, and I think more and more over the course of my career, well before I got sick, as you know, Justin, that's become increasingly the focus of my work and my research on how much a kind of what I would call like an agapic love in the classical tradition of just caring for, wanting to, without regard for how it might benefit you one way or the other, that you want to help, you really go about your life in a way that you genuinely hope and aspire to help other people flourish in your interactions with them. That in our culture, which is very individualistic and sort of promotes competitiveness, that's part of our anesthetic culture, I think. People are very suspicious about that. That when you tell them to do that, they think you're up to something. Like you have an ulterior motive. You're trying to get something out of me. But I really believe, not just out of faith, but because of there's lots of scientific evidence for it, that if you live your life that way, you're going to flourish. Not only are you become a more virtuous person that people will admire, but you're going to be a more joyful person. It's surprising to me how people don't want to hear that message. I had an experience at APA. So I won't say who it is because I don't want to embarrass the person, but I'll just say it was a president of another division. And there was a meeting of other presidents of different societies. And we were having a conversation, and somebody was interrogating the president of Division 32, which is humanistic psychology, about what has humanistic psychology done lately, and kind of giving her a hard time. Roxanne is the current president. And Roxanne handled that really well, in that she just kind of joked back, like didn't take the question, didn't dignify the question by taking it seriously. And then when she was done, I looked at the guy and I said, well, I think humanistic psychology is a hermeneutic of love. And I swear to God, he turned around and walked away, which was just the weirdest thing. Anyway, I just find that I find that very interesting, that, and it's not the first time that kind of thing has happened, that making the point that I just made is there's certain people that have a very aversive reaction to it. And I find that interesting. I'm not sure, I don't understand it, to be honest with you, but I find it very interesting. But I suspect it has to do with what I've been calling anesthetic consciousness.
It's a clinical point that also seems to be a cultural point, that if you numb yourself to caring deeply for others, or sort of taking an ironic position towards legitimate caring, letting things matter to you, that you also cut yourself off from the possibility of feeling fulfilled, or like you're really enjoying life.
I guess that part of the problem is people buy the myth that the way you get happiness is by being self-serving, by maximizing your own pleasure and material gain at the expense of other people, because that's so ingrained in our culture. It's sort of part of neoliberal mindset, right? So when you say something like that, it's profoundly counterculture. And the way the culture tries to preserve itself is then to take something like that, something profound and central to what it means to live a meaningful life, something like love, and then to trivialize it, to turn it into sort of something merely sentimental, and reduce it to something contemptible. I think that's a big problem. And it's a big problem among men in particular. By the way, I have another project that I'm working on masculinity. There's toxic masculinity, and I'm interested in the question of, well, what's the alternative to toxic masculinity? But that's maybe for another time.
Yeah, I know I've kept you for a couple hours here, so I guess, there's so much to say, but I'm wondering if there's any points that you didn't get to make that you wanted to kind of end on, or if you want to draw things together in a certain way.
I hope that in the course of this interview, you've done such a fine job of asking me questions that sort of cover sort of the sort of narrative arc of my career. And the way that our conversation has unfolded, I think maybe will help people to understand why I study the things that I do that seem very disconnected from each other, because I study lots of different things. And I imagine if somebody looks at my curriculum vitae, they're like, what does any of this have to do with each other? But to me, they all come down, they all connect, right? Because I study, the history of psychiatry, because I think we can't really get ourselves out of the mess that we're in presently unless we understand the historical origins of our current situation. It's that old, who said, those who fail to study history are doomed to repeat it. I think that's true. And, but at the heart of it, everything that I do is driven by a fundamentally ethical concern with a recognition and a desire to preserve human dignity. And what I think discloses human dignity, what I think reveals the dignity of other people, is precisely what I've been calling love. Not sentimentality, but a recognition of what's distinctly unique and irreplaceable, non-fungible, and precious about each person that we encounter. And that goes back, I'll go back to the first question you asked me. That goes back to my mom, right? Who taught me that, all real living is meeting. And I found that my mom she was right. And here I am having 54 years old, facing, a very serious diagnosis in the end of my life. And looking back, I could say she was right all along. And I'm very glad that she taught me that and oriented me towards a life where I made that a priority.
And made a million pages of footnotes on those 5 words.
Yeah. Yeah. So, so I guess I'll end on that note.
Yeah, that's a beautiful full circle. Thank you, Brent. Thank you for listening to the Mad in America podcast. For more news, views, and updates, visit madinamerica.com.